Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. Today, what I want to talk about is how I interpret ovarian reserve values. This is a really, really important thought process because it really does affect so many things about, what the values are and then what treatment options are available. So we just had a robust episode on anti-Mullerian hormone and everything that represents, but basically the anti-Mullerian hormone comes from the small antral follicles, and basically that is a surrogate marker for how many eggs somebody has left in their body. And so if somebody has a low anti-Mullerian hormone, that means that they have low egg reserve. If somebody has a high anti-Mullerian hormone, that means that there's still a lot of eggs to work with. And, this is not a fertility test, I will be clear, because we see people with low anti-Mullerian hormones get pregnant all the time, but it really does portend response to medications in a treatment setting, such as gonadotropins, IVF. And so, when we look at, as an REI, when I look at anti-Mullerian hormone levels, first of all, I think about, okay, like, is this low compared to where the averages are for somebody's age? So if somebody's 32 and has AMH of 0.4, I'm going to get worried about that in terms of their reproductive timeline. Also, if I'm like thinking about medication dosing, if I'm doing IVF and somebody has an anti-Mullerian hormone of 10, you better believe I'm going to be a little bit stingier on my medications because I know they're going to go farther, just because somebody has a lot of eggs in there. And I also don't want to make them sick with hyperstimulation syndrome. So AMH is an excellent marker for how many eggs somebody has left in their body, specifically relative to their age. Okay, so then another test that we have, which actually correlates with the anti-Mullerian hormone, is an ultrasound-based test, which is called the antral follicle count. The best time to get an antral follicle count is during the follicular phase, right? When somebody's on their period, actually, as gynecologists, we think that's totally acceptable to sweep through the ovaries and really count how many follicles between 2 to 9 millimeters are there. And in general, if that number is above 10, then we're like, okay, that's a reasonable ovarian reserve. But if that number is less than 10, just like when the AMH is less than 1, that suggests that there's, fewer eggs to work with in a given cycle. The premise behind the AFC is that we don't just go through one egg in a given month, we go through groups of eggs. I like to say that eggs are social. And so as we get older and as our body is recognizing an overall lower number of eggs, our bodies start conserving that number of eggs that we go through in a month. So, for instance, if I'm 25 and I have a follicle count of 25, for instance, that means I go through a nice, robust group of 25 follicles in that month. But say I'm 45 and my body's recognizing a low egg number, that number might shrink to like 4, 5, 6, follicles. Again, this is highly individualized, but because the body recognizes a lower egg number, it conserves, which means there's fewer of those follicles available when we go to try to stimulate them, say, in an IVF process. And so the AMH and the AFC, they tend to correlate with each other. If they are discordant, that's always interesting because I always ask myself, okay, is this person smoking? Does this person carry extra weight? What is the FSH? What's the estradiol, which we'll talk about in a second. But, the antral follicle count suggests how many eggs could I get to in an IVF cycle, if I got the whole cohort of this month. And so if somebody's AMH is low, I might really be bold with my medications so that I can get as many eggs as is possible. You can't always get the whole cohort, but there's tips and tricks and protocols that we like to try to make sure that we're optimizing as much as possible. I always tell my patients, you pay the same amount, whether I get 15 eggs or 3 eggs. And so let's do our best to get as many eggs as is possible. Okay. So then there's the follicle stimulating hormone and the estrogen. So this requires an explanation of physiology. If you're a female physician, perhaps you remember this from medical school, but maybe very vaguely. So the ovaries and the brain are always in a conversation with each other. These tests are blood tests, right? They're hormones. And the ovaries make estrogen, and the anterior pituitary makes follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And so when the ovaries are doing a fine job, right, doing what they're supposed to do, the follicle stimulating hormone is in a normal range, right? But as we get older, especially, and our ovaries are having a harder time doing their job, the brain then recognizes that and compensates and sends a stronger signal so that the ovaries then can better do their job. So for instance, say the estrogen ovaries are having a hard time making estrogen, the brain recognizes that an FSH of 8 isn't cutting it for the ovaries to do their job. it might turn up that signal to like 12, 13, 15. And then the ovaries are like, oh yeah, I get it. I'll do my job now. Thanks for knocking a little harder, right, on the system. And so then, although that the cycles keep going, I consider this like a compensated state because the ovaries are, being stimulated by more and more and more FSH to be able to do their job. Now, why does this matter? This matters because any treatments that we do, for the most part, in the fertility world, are going to work to raise FSH. So, for instance, say, I give letrozole. Letrozole is a medication to help somebody ovulate, right? It works because it tricks the body into thinking they're the low estrogen state, sends a message to the brain then works harder, pumps out more follicle stimulating hormone, and then the system continues. Similarly, when we're trying to give FSH from the outside world, like gonal F, follistim, to be able to stimulate follicles, we do this outside of IVF, we do this with IVF. But if the body already sees a lot of FSH from its physiology, when we try to give FSH from the outside world, it's like, what's the point? I already see so much FSH. And that delta, that change between where the body normally lives and what we're trying to do with our meds is just not enough to create a response. And so you might hear the term FSH resistance. I love getting FSH and estrogen because it helps me understand, what resistance might I have to overcome to be able to kick somebody's ovaries into gear. Sometimes I use estrogen priming. That's a great way to lower the body's FSH without, too much suppression to be able to then get a cohort. It's one of our newer strategies in the last 10 years. But I think it's really important to understand, if the FSH is 20, 25, 30, why might an IVF cycle not work? It's because the body is already living in a sea of FSH. And when we give our hormones from the outside world, it's just not seeing that much of a difference. It's also why in primary ovarian insufficiency, a lot of times people are just as successful at home as in the clinic because we really can't get a change in that delta for the most part. So what I would say is there's 3 different ways that we can look at ovarian reserve. One of them is the anti-Mullerian hormone blood test. Another is the antral follicle count ultrasound. Another is the combination of the follicle stimulating hormone and the estrogen. I go through those in a lot of detail in other podcasts, but I think understanding like anti-Mullerian hormone, we start at a certain level, it goes down, down, down. So the asymptote is actually like 0, right? FSH goes up, up, up with time. And so it's really infinity, right? I might see an FSH of like 80, 100, 120. That means that somebody's ovaries are really not doing well and the brain is working awfully hard. So it's interesting that the asymptote for AMH is 0. And then, FSH, the sky's the limit. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about in and of itself. And then the antral follicle count ultrasound really suggests how many eggs is this person going through in a given month and how many eggs might I have access to that might respond to stimulation if we do a cycle. So, do I put more weight on one than the other? I really don't, because I believe that this has to be interpreted in the context of each person's fertility story, each person's genetics, each person's family building goals, and all those things. But I think that there's certain correlations that we know about, for instance, AMH with medication dose and FSH with resistance that really help us shape each treatment plan in a very thoughtful and scientific way. So I hope this was helpful. Until the next time, I love you. Bye.